Welcome to MyCare Channel. My name is Emily Anderson and today is Tuesday the 7th of December. Last week I had the chance to sit down and chat to the CEO of Aspect, Autism Australia, Jacqui Borland. We had a chat all about diagnosis and why it's so important. Let's check it out. Welcome to MyCare Channel. I'm here today with Jacqui Borland, the CEO of Autism Spectrum Australia. We're going to have a discussion about the importance of diagnosis. Hey Jacqui, it's good for you to be here.
Great to be here.
Tell me, autism spectrum, what is the autism spectrum?
So the autism spectrum is a condition, and it's every person who is on the autism spectrum is different, and that's why it's called the autism spectrum. So it's a condition that affects how an individual interacts with their world. So it might be to do with their communication, their social interaction, their sensory understanding, or how they feel in the world. All of those things are part of the autism spectrum.
And how does it present itself? What are some common ways it presents itself in people?
Yep, so there's always something to do with communication. So for some autistic people, it may be that they don't verbally communicate, they may use non-verbal communication. Other people on the autism spectrum may use words, but they may have difficulty having conversations, so the sort of finer points of communication. Sometimes autistic people struggle a little bit in social situations and become a bit overwhelmed. And sometimes autistic people have different experiences of the sensory environment, and so loud noises or busy spaces or sound or lights may all be difficult, or they process them differently.
And the current statistic is that 1 in 70 people have autism. How did they come up with that figure?
Well, this is a figure that's it's actually been changing over the years, and it's collected internationally, so to do with the number of people who are diagnosed on the autism spectrum. And so I think the figure 1 in 70 actually has levelled out in the last few years. It was increasing, 10 or 15 years ago it was less, but as we understand autism more and the criteria around assessment are better understood, we find that figure of 1 in 70 is consistent across different countries, different cultures where people are collecting the information. It seems to be a fairly standard number that we've agreed on now.
Yeah, that's remarkable.
It is.
Really great to hear that research has come that far. You talked about the assessment criteria. How do you get diagnosed?
Yeah, so an autism assessment is quite a complex thing to go through. So there's certainly no one test. It's not a blood test. It's not a simple thing to have an autism assessment. So there's usually a number of people that might be involved, such as a paediatrician, a psychologist, a speech pathologist, an occupational therapist. And those professionals all have access to questionnaires, tools, observations that they make of the person, or they may, if it's a young child, they'll talk with the child's parents or carers to get a full picture of everything that's going on for that person. And then we have what's called a diagnostic manual that they use, and that talks about the different criteria, and if on the balance of all of those assessments and those discussions the person meets the criteria, then they may get a diagnosis of autism.
And why is diagnosis important?
Well, look, diagnosis is important because it does two things. First of all, it helps carers or teachers understand about the person or the child, which helps to understand what supports to put in place for that person. So it could be putting in place supports at home or supports at childcare or school that help that child communicate, or help that child communicate their needs, which will help them not be so frustrated perhaps or stressed, help the child learn. So I guess a diagnosis is that key to understanding, and understanding is the start of really putting in great supports for an autistic person. And I guess the second thing is that a diagnosis opens up access to supports such as the NDIS or funding at school for school supports. So it is really an important step. And most parents, and in fact even adults who are diagnosed later, really, even though they may have been somewhat anxious, later reflect that, you know, having that diagnosis was a real key to you know, making really positive progress.
And you talk a lot about the child, and
Yep.
but then you've got adult diagnosis as well. What happens when you aren't diagnosed until very later?
Yeah, and look, we're getting much better at diagnosing, and what we know is that the younger a child is diagnosed, the sooner we can put in place those supports. And then by doing that, you know, you're helping the child learn, you're helping them develop. So that's a good thing. But for many people, and because autism is a spectrum, so sometimes it's actually not easy to see that autism might be a factor in someone's life until they get to school or until they become a teenager. And so sometimes people aren't diagnosed until later. Certainly there are some people who aren't diagnosed until they're adults, and they may have in fact gone through school not really understanding why they were struggling, and their families and their teachers may not have had that understanding to know what it was. There was something, but they didn't know what it was, and sometimes it's not until they read something or they see something that it sparks that interest in finding out more. And so, you know, it's not uncommon for people to be diagnosed as adults, even though we're much better at diagnosing young children these days as well.
Right. And I've heard about how girls are harder to diagnose than boys. Is that a myth, or is there truth in that?
Well, it's interesting. A few years ago, the literature and the research said that 5 times as many boys would be diagnosed as being on the autism spectrum than girls. But what we're understanding now is, in fact, it is that girls are presenting differently, and so some of those really obvious signs in boys that we are used to seeing aren't present in girls, and so it is more common for girls to, I think, be misdiagnosed or not to be diagnosed. But we are getting better at understanding that, and so these days more girls are being diagnosed, but I think we've still got some work to do to really understand how autism presents and what the differences are in girls who are on the autism spectrum.
What are some of those differences?
Well, for example, sometimes girls seem to be better at perhaps masking. So girls are more naturally social, and so they may be better at masking some of their characteristics. So they may in fact have better language. You know, generally little girls have better language than little boys. So that's some of the things so therefore it doesn't get picked up. But as well, girls, you know, maybe one of the characteristics of autism in children is these very special interests. They used to be called obsessions. Now we call them special interests or passions because we like to talk much more positively. But if a girl has a special interest in dolls or horses, then people think that's just what girls do. Whereas if a boy has special interest in trains and just won't talk about anything else, then people are alert to picking that up. So I think we're just getting better at understanding. You know, before I think we just didn't pick up girls as much.
And you mentioned the trains.
Yeah.
I do find that fascinating. Why trains? Why are trains so popular?
Look, I just said trains, but in fact, and it is a common interest.
Yeah.
However, look, I think one of the characteristics of autism is that autistic people have these special interests, and they can be a whole range of things. And sometimes they change. So it might be trains when a little boy's or a child's young, and then it moves to something else. So it can be a whole range of really fascinating and interesting interests. And you know, I think what we know is, in fact, some of that really intense interest can lead to a career or to being really an expert in that thing. And so, that's what we see as, one of the strengths of that really intense fascination and wanting to know everything about a particular subject.
And I wanted to ask as well, because we're talking so much about the importance of diagnosis and the way that when you're diagnosed, some of your interests and stuff can be used for such excellent purposes, and you can find careers in that. What's the role of teachers and carers and people who aren't family in helping parents get their children diagnosed? Is there ever an appropriate time to suggest someone gets tested?
Look, I think the signs that and the developmental characteristics are different in different children. So for some children, their parents feel that there's something different in the way that their baby, a very young baby or very young child, is experiencing or reacting to the world, especially if they've had other children. Sometimes if it's a first child, they don't really know because they haven't got anything to compare it to. So sometimes parents pick things up and they will raise their concern, sometimes with the maternal and child health nurse or a paediatrician, that the child isn't meeting some of those milestones. But for some parents, they don't pick that up, and in some children, the signs don't in fact show up until much later. So it could be a preschool teacher, it could even be a school teacher that starts to understand or starts to see that there's some developmental differences between a child and his or her peers. And so usually that teacher or professional might just raise those concerns with the parent and say, look, this is what I'm seeing. They may suggest, and I think that most teachers would understand that they're not in a position to diagnose autism. They don't have those qualifications or expertise. So they would possibly be suggesting to a parent, if they share those concerns and they see the same things, to perhaps go and see their GP in the first instance, and then that GP might refer them to a paediatrician or an assessment team.
And what are some of the emotions that come with diagnosis?
For the parent?
And the child, or
I guess,
adult.
For a very young child, I think it's really, we have to really, and sometimes it helps when we talk to parents. I mean, the child, the week before they're assessed and the week after they're assessed, they're still the same child. So they're still doing the same wonderful things, and they're, perhaps having difficulties in the same areas. So for the child, if they're very young, there's not really, much impact of going through an assessment. Parents are sometimes, worried, of course, and no parent wants to, think about, that their child may have very, significant challenges in life. But what we tend to find with parents is that once they've been through that assessment and they've seen, with the assessment comes some really rich reports with ideas of how to work with their child. As soon as, when parents go through that process, they start reading about autism. So it actually opens up a whole sort of area and level of understanding that actually helps them make really positive changes. And then their child's happier, and so then the whole family is happier. So, it can be very daunting, and parents, of course, will worry, but generally parents say that it's a positive sort of step in their life.
And so your motto at Aspect is a different brilliant. Could you tell me a bit more about that?
Yeah. So look, we really believe it. So we talk about a different brilliant, and it's understanding and celebrating the strengths, the interests and the aspirations of autistic people. So it's coming from that strength-based approach, rather than, maybe a few years ago, more traditionally, when people talked about autism or any disability, it was a deficit. It was about what the person can't do and what the person will never be able to do. Whereas we understand that, in fact, by thinking about what the child or the autistic person can do and what their interests are, that's in fact the best way to help them and to support them so that they will have the best quality of life and the best opportunities. So it's just a real switch, and everyone who works at Aspect is very, really believes in that approach, and it's the way, everyone works better, everyone reacts better if someone works with their strengths and their interests. So it's just a really great way of working, and you know, we see really great outcomes for the children and the adults that we work with.
Incredible. Well, thank you, Jacqui, for coming in today. I enjoyed our chat and I learnt so much about diagnosis and autism spectrum. Thank you.
Thank you, it was a pleasure.
There are things we can do and things we can't. Sometimes we need just a little bit of help, and sometimes quite a lot. Whatever your need as a person living with a disability, MyCare Channel can put you in touch with the people who can assist. You don't need to navigate the process alone. Just call us on 1300 461 300 or visit mycarechannel.org.au, and we'll start you on the journey of a life lived to the best of your ability.